Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank
Great.
you, guys.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome to Oh Brother, Not Another Podcast, sponsored by Verso Studios at the Westport Library and available on all podcast platforms. My name is Miggs Burrows.
And I'm Trace Burrows, and we're happy today to have on our show Ted Alexandro, stand-up comedian who's been on so many shows: David Letterman, Late Night with Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Kimmel, the Late Late Show with Craig Ferguson. He's done Dr. Katz. I'd like to ask you about that because I used to love that show. And you've done Comedy Central's specials and done some movies. Dr. Katz. So did you play yourself on Dr. Katz?
I did. I was a patient of the good doctor. I played myself like many comedians, and that was exciting, as you might imagine. You know, I was a fan of the show as well and had seen many of my favorites over the years. So, yeah, that was one of those. I mean, although it's obviously a little more of a cult show than like the late night shows when you get the call for Letterman or Conan, I'd say that meant as much to me because it was just, it was something that so many good comedians had been on, comedians that I respected. So the combination of that and also the seeing yourself in Squiggle Vision.
Squiggle Bit, yeah, that was great. Did you like the way they portrayed you? I mean, with your...
Yeah, no, I was fine with it. You know, I mean, I had hair and no beard back then, so it was kind of a flip of our current presentation. But yeah, it was great, man. It was fun. I was a fan of Jonathan Katz. I had worked with him years prior, so I loved him as a comedian. And he was, he's just one of those guys that comics know and love. Even if the larger public didn't know him before Dr. Katz, comedians knew him and respected him because he's just so funny, so dry. Also a musician, like myself, I had started in music. So yeah, I think, all of those factors, I just, I love the guy.
Mm-hmm. So you play jazz piano, right?
Well, yeah, in quotes. I mean, I don't do it anymore, which is why, I wouldn't call myself a jazz piano player, but I studied jazz piano for 2 years at City College in New York. Yeah. And I mean, I loved it, but I was in over my head and had the good sense to recognize that and move on to comedy, so it was like, all right, I'll just one by one, I'm going to go through the arts. I think, just being a clown was really all that was left. So luckily comedy worked out.
Yeah.
Do you find a corollary between music? I mean, there's the obvious ones, maybe rhythm and, and there's that old thing about the music is the space between the notes, not the notes, and blah, blah, blah. Any corollaries between music and comedy?
Yeah, definitely. I don't think it's something necessarily that you can quantify, but maybe it's just an ear for rhythm and pacing and breath and all the things you mentioned in terms of spacing, a cadence of when to speak and not speak, allowing the crowd to laugh and kind of holding in the pocket and not rushing, finding your tempo and your pace as a comedian on stage.
So when you started writing material for yourself, the thing that comes to mind is like King of Comedy, where he's in his mother's cellar and I guess he's got cutouts of audience people and he's playing with them. So did you just jump into it, take your material, went to some club, waited, when the time when they allow, and as long as you sign up and you're in line? Is that how you started?
Yeah, that was basically the road, minus the cutouts of the the cardboard people. I did the mirror thing occasionally just to kind of, I thought it was like something to do, like to just kind of try to see how I looked and hold a microphone. And so I did that a few times in the early going, as I'd imagine a lot of comedians or artists in general, performing artists, have done. But the thing you realize quickly about comedy is there's no substitution for being in front of people. You have to do it in front of people, unlike music where you can do it in a recording studio and then maybe it can evolve and take on different tones and colors, speaking of music, when you take it touring. But comedy, you kind of perfect it in front of the crowd, and they're kind of partners in a sense of shaping it and editing it and letting you know what's working and what's not. So yeah, for me, my road was just doing that, going to every little room I could find that had a microphone, signing my name on countless lists, waiting in the back, sometimes not even getting on, all those things. Yeah. And that's what you have to do in the early going when you're kind of deciding to do it. Because it is something that you have to decide to do and keep deciding, because there's a lot of things telling you maybe you shouldn't do this. So it is a decision, and you know, you have to love it, and that's what keeps you going back, no matter the circumstances you find yourself in.
Did you ever have to, I think it was a Birbiglia series, I forget what it was called, but where he had to, in order to earn a spot, you had to give out flyers on the street corner. If you gave out 500 flyers, you got a spot. Was that a real thing?
That was a real thing, but luckily I bypassed that. You know, yeah, I was lucky enough that I lived in Queens, so I was kind of halfway between the Manhattan clubs, which there were, you know, probably half a dozen good ones, and probably another half a dozen, you know, just rooms with, you know, bars, whatever it was, and the other half being Long Island. So Long Island had a pretty thriving comedy scene when I was coming up in the early 90s. So I could kind of, you know, and they were two distinct separate scenes, so I could kind of bounce between the two. And the good thing about the Long Island scene was that they were real people. It wasn't like a room full of comedians sitting there kind of in their own notebooks, barely looking up, barely reacting. They were real people, because comedy was still kind of you know, kind of novel and hot at that point. I think it's come back around again, probably a couple times since. But yeah, so that was, I think, helpful in my development, that I was in front of real people a couple nights a week on Long Island. And then, you know, the Manhattan could be hit or miss depending on what room it was, but it tended to be mostly fellow comedians.
Mm-hmm. So what do you, if you got your, memorize your, do you have any like cheat sheets, like in case you flake out and you want to know where you were?
Yeah, it's so seamless. Yeah, I just saw you know, your what's one I just saw? Oh, the senior class of Earth. Yeah, I mean, it's so seamless.
You should have wrote it on your hand.
Yeah,
you should have wrote the title on your hand.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Senior class of Earth.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah. In the early going, I did exactly that. I did write down keywords or bullet points or things that would jog my memory, because the thought of doing stand-up in the early going, and you know, people may or may not realize this, but I think almost all comedians, and there may be a few that were just hit the ground running and didn't have those nerves, but almost all comedians were terrified, you know, but not to the point where it paralyzes you. Terrified and you know, like hit with adrenaline that I have to do this. I love to do this. I'm scared to death. I don't know if I'll remember my act, but just the thrill of pursuing it and trying to figure it out and having an inkling, I think I can do this. And then the first year or two, you can and you can't. You know, you have your moments where you think you're on top of the world, and then you bomb miserably and kind of go back to the drawing board. But you need all of those experiences, you know. So that's kind of going, you know, through the fire of building those layers of armor and all the experiences that you need as a comedian. So to the point of when I get to senior class, you know, which was, I think was my fifth, maybe my fourth special at that point. You know, you're really not thrown, I'm not going to say by anything, but you've seen so much. You know, I've been doing this like 30 years now. So you've seen so much that anything that happens, you kind of welcome as an opportunity, you know, to see what you could do with it, or just to acknowledge it, which when you're younger, you don't have that sense. When you're younger, you think everything has to be like, you have to hit a bullseye and hit a home run. Sometimes it's as simple as acknowledging it. Other times it's as simple as waiting because the crowd's already laughing because they know what's going on. So those are all things, again, that you learn over time, kind of to your earlier point about music, knowing when to be quiet. You know, if they're laughing, sometimes just stand there. You know, I mean, even the greats, Jack Benny and people, Carson, knowing when to stand there and allow them to laugh. And then when you do speak, it's multiple. It's, you know, there's an exponential kind of growth in the laugh because there's been an anticipation.
What happens if you have a story, so you have a joke, which is basically a story, and some drunk guy breaks the sort of the rhythm and yells some stupid thing out. How do you recover from something like that? Do you ignore them, or do you have to like hit back with some kind of?
It depends on how good their contribution is. Usually it's not, and one of the options you mentioned is the best course of action. I've gotten better at ignoring. Again, as a younger comic, you kind of almost feel, well, there's two dynamics. One is that you think everyone can hear what you're hearing, which is not the case. The people in the back don't hear what the guy in the front row just said to you. And then you just look like you're reacting to nothing or overreacting in some cases to nothing. So sometimes the best course of action is to ignore. And that's a skill that develops over time too. It's like, and I was a teacher too in my early years. So there's that thing of like, I heard that interruption. I know they're attempting to interject themselves or maybe throw me off my train of thought, but I'm going to ignore it. And all of that is going on in your head, you know, and in comedy, again, this is probably something that most people don't realize. You're speaking, but there are like 10 different things. You're thinking of the next joke. You're thinking of the next section. You're thinking of the person who just yelled something. Am I going to ignore that or say something? So yeah, you're constantly making decisions in real time while kind of having this real seamless presentation that you're speaking off the cuff. But to answer your question, yeah, sometimes it's ignoring, other times it's addressing. You know, again, if it's something loud that the whole crowd heard, maybe they're already laughing, maybe they're waiting for your response. You kind of have to get a sense of, you know, how should I proceed here?
And what is the thing I hear constantly a lot on Mark Maron talks about it, you know, I mean, everyone talks the good room, you know, and he talks about there's rooms when he's interviewing other comedians, I won't do that room. I'll never do that room again. And there's a good, what makes a room good? I mean, a room it's the people, not the room, is it? Or does the room have really an impact?
It is an interesting question. I do think there are bad rooms over the course of time, because like any establishment, they're mismanaged. The people, when they're brought in, are not welcomed properly. It's not, you know, it's kind of the wrong tone is set from, it's kind of like who's in charge here. There's a lot of comedy clubs and performance spaces that are like that. And then there's other places where you do feel welcomed. You do feel like it's a night of the arts, or a night, you know, that is significant. And I think that sets a tone as well. So, but having said that, it doesn't matter. Once you get on stage, you're a comedian, and that's the crowd. Like you said, I could be at Madison Square Garden, or I could be at a bar show. It's people sitting in chairs facing me, and I'm speaking into a device that amplifies my voice. It's always the same. It's always the same. So, you know, in a weird way, it's going to be easier when you're doing Madison Square Garden or Letterman or Carnegie Hall or Conan, because those are the peak experiences. You've gone through a million bad rooms or tough rooms to earn those kind of, I'm not going to say easy, because it's still, you have to kind of manage your nerves and there's all that type of thing. But those quote unquote bad rooms are important. They're not just necessary, they're important.
Sure. But the same joke won't play the same in Norway as it would in Fairfield, where you were just at. Will it, or not, or does it matter?
Well, I think luckily in my career, there's been a kind of the earth has shrunk due to the internet, and you know, before that, cable television, you know, all of these things have shrunk the experience so that people have a baseline kind of awareness of certain things that maybe they wouldn't have years prior. So, you know, I've been astounded by that when I've done international gigs, whether it was Norway or, you know, Scandinavian countries or the Middle East for that matter, where I was a little in my head before I got in, like, is this going to, even talking to the other comedians, like, will this work? Will that work? But but ultimately the best test is to do it, you know, unless it's something that might be offensive to the culture, like, you know, then it's a good idea to check. But as far as like, will this work, won't this work, that's really kind of true whether I'm one town over or the other side of the country or the other side of the world. You know, there's going to be, and sometimes jokes just don't work for reasons you don't even understand. Like I've told this joke 1,000 times, like, and you talk about being, you know, in your head, like, even though I'm on to the next joke, in my head, I'm saying like, did I like stand differently, or did I forget a word? Like, you know, or sometimes I'll even say that to the crowd. I was like, you know, sometimes I'll do the joke over. I'm going to say that didn't land the way I'm used to. So I'm going to, you know, I'm going to take it again, and you know, and then I'll just start over. And then they're laughing because, you know, you're starting the same exact wording and the same premise. So they're laughing just at the, you know, the ridiculousness that you weren't pleased with the first
like
attempt.
A meta joke. Yeah, that's a joke of a joke.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and well, there's a lot of things you covered there, but you talked about the physical. Did I stand a little differently? You have a unique physical. Every comedian is unique in a way physically. You know, they used to talk about Eddie Murphy prowling, and somebody else would, you know, strut and this and that. But you do have like I don't know how to describe it, but you use your body and you use your eyes very deliberately, or, you know, it just comes off and it feeds the humor. It accents the humor, embellishes it, or whatever. Is it something developed over years, or it's just your natural body language?
Yeah, thanks. Well, that's a good question. You know, I think it's a little bit of both. You know, I think I naturally have a physicality as a performer. When I was younger, I think it was a little more maybe manic and amped up because you're wanting so badly to do well. And then as I've matured as a person and as a performer, I think it's still there, but I control it a little bit more. You know, like I'm a little bit more kind of dialed down, a little more laid back, a little more like who I am off stage. But I do accent it with physicality, with movement. I like all those things, you know, and I think as a student of comedy too, you mentioned whether it's Eddie Murphy, or even I watched Chris Rock's new special last night. He's someone who prowls the stage and uses it really well, and is very different from his offstage persona. You know, he's kind of adopts that cadence of a preacher, or, you know, someone who's kind of shouting. So all of those things as a student of comedy are fascinating to me. I remember talking to Louis Black years ago, and he just said, I found out I was funnier when I yelled. You know, so like something as simple as that. And I teach comedy too sometimes. So I tell younger comedians, consider your volume, you know, because it's a very simple thing. But you know, whether you're yelling, whispering, or something in between, it hits differently. So consider, how do I best serve the joke? How do I best serve the idea in my performance and in my volume? And, you know, I tour with Jim Gaffigan, who's a master of all the dynamics. I mean, he literally goes down to a whisper and talks to himself, and then yells. And so, like, you know, I almost consider him like Carlin with the dynamics, the audio dynamics. Like if you looked at a chart of the highs and lows, you know, they would be wider than certainly me, but than most comedians. So I find all those things fascinating.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm back to your senior class because that's the one I watched today. I watched others before when we were preparing for your first round. But so there was this one thing, I think it was towards the end, but it was all about the women and how I could begin to just it's the customer service thing about, you know, ultimately men are women's, when they finally find a man, that's the ultimate customer service. It's got the biggest laugh of the set, I think, and applause and everything. Was that a tried and true build up for that, and you knew it, or did it surprise you in any way, or does the reactions ever surprise you? And then do you finesse the joke accordingly? Yeah.
Now, do you mean, did it surprise me the night of the taping?
Yeah.
No. By the night of the taping, you're pretty much, you know, ideally you shouldn't be surprised by too much of anything as far as where the jokes land and the cadence, the rhythm of everything. So no, you know, you're kind of almost a conductor at that point. You're conducting the crowd to exactly, you know, the more or less the pace you want, where you want them to land, what you want the reaction to be. all of that. So, but as you're building it, for sure, you're surprised by things. And if you're listening, you can hear where they want more. So that was a bit the one you're talking about, where that built, and even my volume built, because I haven't really been a yeller or someone who, you know, takes, like, I don't shout very much on stage. But I realized with that bit that adding more volume to it and kind of building, you're both in your agitation and literally in your volume, that it helps the joke, you know, because you're building to, you know, a crescendo. So yeah, so those are things that you learn in the development of the material, but come the night of the special, all of that is finely tuned.
Mm-hmm.
And just one more comment on that set was I found myself wanting, and I don't know whether whether you tend to go back, revisit a piece and expand it. Like I found myself wanting more of the hot bagel guy, you know, a little bit. I mean, I thought, because, you know, it struck a chord with, I'm sure, every guy, you know, whether they admit it or not. So, yeah, do you ever go back and say, you know, that needs another 30 seconds or another minute, or not needs, but I'd like to build on it, you know?
Yeah, sometimes I do. Sometimes I think less is more, you know, like with the idea you're talking about, it's that idea of, as a heterosexual man, sometimes like guys make you nervous, like the guy at the bagel shop, you know. So, and it's just acknowledging that feeling. And so I told that on stage one night, because that's one of the fun things about stand-up, is just noticing those moments in real life and saying to yourself, oh, you know, I wonder if this will translate to the stage. It's a little bit, you know, vulnerable, a little bit out there, but can I articulate it in such a way that it hits the mark of what I'm trying to communicate? So yeah, that was one of those. And I like those types of foundations of jokes, because they're funny it's a funny scenario. Like it's almost like out of Seinfeld, or, you know, it's almost like it could be in a sitcom, that moment, that idea could be a scene. So yeah, but I do waver on certain jokes, like is less more, or is more? Does it need more? And for me, it just comes down to whether something occurs to me. You know, if I feel a joke is finished, then usually that's it. Aside from adding a layer of physicality, or maybe the timing of it, maybe a silence, a pause, a facial expression, all of those things kind of come. And the more you do it, just one night, another little beat finds its way in. And if you're recording, which you should be every night, then you listen back and you're like, oh, you know, I did something different there. And then you take note of it and you make it part of that bit.
So how do you decide, like, I need a whole new set of material? Let's say you've been doing it for, I don't know, so many years. What's the decision making in doing that? And when you do decide that I need to make up a whole new hour of stuff, is that how it works? Or do you actually start making notes and saying, like, in 9 months I'll have created enough material for a whole new show?
Yeah, I think that varies for everyone, the timetable. Some comedians just put out 1 hour and that's their career, or 2 hours, you know. Yeah. I've put out 5 so far. Jim, who I tour with, Jim Gaffigan, we just recorded his 10th 2 weeks ago in Tampa. So I mean, he's in rare air with 10 specials, and he's very disciplined and hardworking about putting the last hour away, because that's the hardest thing for any comedian, especially when you've been in it a while. You almost feel like, you know, I'm going to sit with this hour for a while. Yeah. But yeah, he and a lot of the greats are quick to drop it. You know, I used to tour with Lewis Black and other people that they'll just put it aside and kind of make it off limits. That's really what you have to do. You have to go back to that beginner's mentality. I mean, you didn't have an hour when you started. You know, you were building 5 minutes, much less an hour. So that's kind of what you have to go back to. So I go back and forth. I'm not as diligent as Jim or some of these guys that put out a special every year or every 2 years. But you know, I'll kind of approach it like I give myself a bit of a deadline, like I want to get to an hour. But then because I find like if I record it then, it'll lose something. Like I was talking about with musicians, they record it, and then when they tour with it, it becomes something else. And I feel the same with comedy. Like bits that I think are done, if I do them another year or even 6 months, they're better, you know? So sometimes I feel as though you're losing something by recording things too quickly and moving on too quickly from something that can evolve, you know, and have another color, another moment, just from the performing of it. And again, listening to the crowd, and things just happen some nights. So, you know, that's my opinion on it, that it's fun to live with things for a while, especially if you like them, you know. If you're tired, that's a different thing. If you're tired of your act or certain jokes, then by all means, it's time to put it to bed, because you don't want to put yourself through that, and you want to put the crowd through that.
Right. So do you make notes? Like, let's say you're walking. Are you confident, like when you get back home, that you know you remember that, or like for me, I think I have great ideas. Oh, that's an awesome idea, and then when I get home, what was that idea? I have no idea.
That idea was going to change the world. Yes. Yeah, no, that's one of the cardinal rules of comedy, and probably the arts in general. When you have that idea, put it in your phone, put it in a notebook.
Yeah.
You know, if you're in the middle of the night, turn the lights on, write it down. Don't let that thing escape, because anything that excites you, you know, and I also take that approach with writing. Like, you know, writing is always kind of a bit of a chore. Like you put it off, or you don't want to get to it. But when you have that idea and you're excited and you're at a notebook or a laptop or whatever, you know, I think it's important to take note of that feeling. Like you're excited, you know, stay there. Like, don't just write down the one line that you're excited about. Stay in the chair and like, see if you can do a half hour, an hour, 2 hours. Because it's the excitement is what we're after all the time. So if that excitement of an idea brings you to your seat, stay there, and you know, that will color what comes out.
Yeah.
Now you talk a lot about your somewhat about your personal life, and I think when an early set a special, you had twins, right? You have twins?
Close. They're 16 months apart. Yeah, 3 and 2.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah.
You refer to them as twins. They must be. How old are they now?
Just turned 3, and our daughter will be 2 end of April.
Oh, so it wasn't that old. For some reason I thought it was an older special. Okay, so that's and you had a fiance in the last so you now married?
Yeah, we've so that wasn't the last special.
no.
Senior class, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were engaged at that point, and then Cut Up came after that one. That was during the pandemic. I put out Cut Up. But yes, so we were engaged at that point, and now we've been married 5 years, and we've got the 2 kids. So, and you know, we've moved out from New York out to the woods in Connecticut. So a lot has changed in 5 years.
Oh, well, we're in Westport. You're in upstate Connecticut, or
we're in Killingworth. We're kind of in the woods. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's nice.
Yeah. I'm in Reading.
Oh, nice. So yeah, we're neighbors.
So what's coming up? You're on a current tour? I mean, you did FTC. We missed it, but to miss promoting it. But
yeah. I'm touring with Jim. Kind of, you know, he just wrapped the special, so we're gonna pick up again in April, and then we'll kind of start up again, and I'll be doing some of my own dates. I think I'm doing a tour in the South, like New Orleans, maybe Jacksonville, Mobile, 4 or 5 cities in June. That'll be up on my website within probably the month. But yeah, mostly I'll be touring with Jim. So that's kind of like the a little bit of the deal that I've had to make with myself. You know, it's like, do I go out and fill the calendar with my own dates, my own hour headlining sets, or do I open for Jim? You know, and the difference being I'm playing arenas with Jim, like literally NBA arenas, if not really the nicest theaters in whatever city we're in. And, you know, sometimes flying private planes and staying in nice hotels versus, you know, a hotel on the side of the highway and flying commercial, you know, so all of those things where it's like after 30 years, you're like, you know what, and also make more money, by the way, you know, doing a 20-minute set versus my own hour. So, you know, all those things now, especially now that I have a family, it's like, all right, you know, I'll figure it out. You kind of have to make the bargains that artistically, you know, even though there's a different task when I'm opening for Jim versus, you know, doing my own thing with no holds barred. But yeah, that's kind of, every person and certainly every artist has to figure those things out.
Do you ever are your children old enough to realize that daddy's funny? And the second part question is, do you ever do little jokes with them, like based on gummy bears or things that they, you know, tailor to them, just them?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of an ongoing comedy set amongst the four of us. You know, I don't think they're aware that it is, but you know, they're funny, obviously, because they're kids, and the things that happen are funny. So you're constantly like, to your point earlier of like remembering things. Sometimes I'll even say to my wife, like, this happened or that happened, and she's like, oh, you got to talk about that on stage. Like sometimes it's almost like you're in a wartime experience, or you're in battle and you don't realize it's funny. It's like, oh yeah, that was pretty funny. I guess I should try to figure that out, tell that story, or you know, that situation. One being in my current set, like our son when he was 2.5 swallowed a quarter. So, you know, and that was on Easter Sunday. So like I start out by saying like, we thought it would take 3 days to pass, but it took 5, you know, so that kind of turned into a story, like probably a 3-minute story with different beats. But like in my earlier days, I might not have considered telling that. But I've gotten better at like, you know, recognizing those moments that maybe are like traumatic at the time. Or trying and yeah, and then realizing it makes for good comedy.
No, Chase, any last?
You have any shows coming up you want to promote?
I'm going to be at the Comedy Cellar at the end of March. Those dates are kind of booked week to week, but I'm going to have some dates towards the end of the month. So those will be on tedalexandro.com. When they get booked the week prior. So those will appear probably, I'd say a week or two from now. Yeah, I'll be at the Comedy Cellar in New York City.
Okay, good.
All right.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, and
Yeah.
love to have comedians come on.
Yeah.
It was my pleasure, guys. Thank you. You know, it's I love talking comedy, and you guys did your homework and didn't even have any notes written on your hand.
No, we didn't. Thank you very much, Ted.
Thanks.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.